Um, I will introduce myself first. My name is Molly Ball. I am a writer on politics for The Atlantic magazine, one of your illustrious sponsors here at the Aspen Festival. And I cover principally the presidential campaign, but all kinds of things related to American politics. So if you know any juicy secrets, please be sure to let me know. Our topic today, I'm going to introduce the topic and then our speaker, E.J. Dionne, who you've all really come to see. The topic today is E.J.'s new book, Our Divided Political Heart, which is a fascinating book. The title is a description of what E.J. sees as the central tension in American politics today. I apologize, I've got a little bit of a frog in my throat, as you can tell. I hope you can still hear me. E.J. is arguing that there are twin impulses in the American character toward individualism and liberty on the one hand, but also toward a more communitarian ideal on the other hand, but that this latter ideal has been de-emphasized and has fallen out of our national discourse. And he traces this in part to the influence of the Tea Party. And he's calling for the restoration of this communitarian strain, which he says which he traces throughout history and argues is an equally vibrant and important part of who we are as Americans. And I know E.J. is going to talk about the book a little, so I'll stop there. But I just wanted to pick out a couple of quotes from the book that I think sum it up. At one point he says, "We are a nation of both high noon and it's a wonderful life." And at another point he says, "With nearly complete control of the Republican Party and hegemony within the conservative movement, radical individualism is as close to triumph as it has been at any point since the Gilded Age. Whether it will succeed or fail is now the central question in American politics." So a few words about E.J., who needs very little introduction. You probably know him from his syndicated column, Washington Post column, which appears in our nation's more discerning newspapers all over the country. You may know him also from his frequent appearances on Meet the Press, on MSNBC, and on NPR. I always find that as a sort of pundit presence, E.J. is a refreshing antidote to the dreaded talking head disease. He's never pompous, always measured, but also not afraid to be provocative. For example, his most recent column calls on Justice Antonin Scalia to resign. So applause for that idea. E.J. is also a senior fellow at the Brookings Institution and a professor at the Georgetown Public Policy Institute and the author and editor of numerous books, and on a personal note, a tremendously warm and encouraging colleague. So, E.J., go ahead.
Oh, well, thank you. First of all, fellow Molly Ball fans, I was so excited when I heard that Molly was going to be the person to do this event, because I've been admiring her for a long time, and I am only a recent participant in Twitter, and I am very proud to be a Molly follower. And if you are on Twitter, you will see how hard she's been working the last few days. She got her start in covering Cambodia and then Vegas. You know, and if you think about that, Washington looks really easy. It's like kindergarten after Cambodia and Vegas. So I'm really honored to be with you today. I'll just say a couple of things about the book, and then we can sort of open up a discussion. The book was in some ways inspired by the Tea Party, and actually at the beginning of the book I thank the Tea Party because I do think it is useful for us to engage in an argument about American history. And I think at the heart of our disagreements right now is our view of ourselves. We can't agree on who we are because we can't agree on who we've been. And having thanked the Tea Party, I then go on to criticize them because I think the Tea Party's view of our history, but it's not an eccentric view. There are other very distinguished folks like Louis Hartz who have argued this, that individualism and liberty are the only defining American characteristics, whereas I argue that from the very beginning of our republic, there has been this deep but healthy tension between our love of individualism and our affection for and quest for community, and that America works best when we keep these two impulses in balance. I like to point out to people that the first word of the American Constitution is we. We are a we country, we the people of the United States, and the Constitution lists a whole series of shared goals, including, by the way, providing for the general welfare. Yes, welfare is in the first paragraph of the Constitution of the United States. Or if you go to our Declaration of Independence, the beginning, we all know well that we are endowed by our Creator with certain unalienable rights that among these to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. So it's a very strong libertarian declaration. But the very last paragraph of the Declaration is where our founders pledged their lives, their fortunes, and their sacred honor. They knew that liberty, the liberty they sought, could not be properly protected unless they acted together, unless we paid attention as a nation to some idea of the common good. And so what I do in the book is trace this balance all the way through our history, and we can talk about this more later, especially in a week where we're obsessed with court decisions. I talk a lot about the Constitution. My chapter on the Constitution is called One Nation Conceived in Argument. And that I think it's a mistake to view the founders as having been handed tablets by God that we should follow, and that they intended us to use these tablets to keep our country in 1787. I think this actually does a disservice to the founders because they were very adventurous. Most of the world did not believe you could even create a self-governing republic. But also, we never want to recognize that the founders disagreed with each other. Within a couple of years of the ratification of the Constitution, Alexander Hamilton and James Madison were at each other's throats over whether Hamilton's proposal to establish a Bank of the United States was constitutional. So if the original guys disagree on what the original document says, what are we to make of originalism? As my friend Garrett Epps, and I'll close here in a moment, as my friend Garrett Epps said, sometimes it looks like Justice Scalia and the other originalists want to say, I knew the founders were friends of mine, I know what they think. Last point I want to make is, it related to our argument between individualism and liberty is also an argument over government's role in building up our country and building up our economy. And again, if you go all the way back to the beginning, if you believe that government only became an important force in American life and in the American economy, then you have to write Hamilton, Henry Clay, and Abraham Lincoln out of the American story altogether. Because government didn't begin to play a role in our economy and in large parts of American life when the New Deal came along. It was right from the beginning. Henry Clay called his program the American system, and he called it that to distinguish it between British laissez-faire. Because in America, we believed in partnerships between the public sphere and the private sphere. I think right now we're going through a big argument over whether what I call the long consensus, which I trace from the rise of the progressives all the way through even the administrations of Ronald Reagan and George W. Bush, a long consensus that involved balance between individualism and community, government and the market, public and private, whether we're going to overthrow that consensus, and as Molly kindly pointed out in reading that quotation, whether we're going to go back to the Gilded Age, which is one 35-year period when radical individualism was dominant. All right, I think our friends in the Tea Party read that as the whole of the American story. I argue that it isn't, and I think those of us who are on the progressive side of politics should embrace the American story. We have left this discussion of our story too much to our friends on the right. They have a right to the story too, but so do we, and we should be proud of the American story, and that's part of the reason that I wrote this book. And thank you for letting me introduce it.
Thank you, EJ. So I'd like to start with the Tea Party, since it was so clear to me reading the book that it came out of a moment when you were looking out at what was happening in American politics and just infuriated. But there's a lot of debate right now about where the Tea Party stands at this point. Is it in the doldrums? Has it sort of done what it can do and now is without power? Some would argue you don't see people out in the streets anymore. Glenn Beck is no longer on Fox News. Dick Lugar lost a primary, but Orrin Hatch was able to survive, and a lot of other incumbents have been able to survive. On the other hand, you can argue that the Senate has become much more conservative and that the Tea Party's influence is now internal within the Republican Party and has pushed it farther to the right to the point where they don't need to be out in the streets. Where do you come down on that?
I think the Tea Party, it does not have the same visibility it had from 2009 to 2010, but Orrin Hatch is a perfect example of how powerful they and broader influences on the right end of the Republican Party have been, because Hatch survived that primary only after readjusting himself to the right. I mean, this is a man who worked with Ted Kennedy on some very important legislation, notably the Children's Health Care Bill passed under President Clinton, and also a great national service bill that was passed at the beginning of the Obama administration. Orrin Hatch had to kind of, who is and always was very conservative, had to sort of, if not disown that, really push that aside and make an argument that he was very conservative, as conservative as the Tea Party wanted him to be. I think the Tea Party arose partly out of a dissatisfaction that President Obama was elected, and that shouldn't be surprising because I think political movements sometimes radicalize in response to defeat, and in a lot of ways, the Tea Party is not all that original. A lot of its ideas go back to the old American right, some of the anti-New Deal right way back in the 30s. I trace through Glenn Beck some of their ideas to the John Birch Society, actually, in the 1960s. I quote courtesy of some, I think it's from Kate Zernike of the New York Times, who did a really nice book on the Tea Party, very fair-minded book, not a partisan book at all. And I think it was Kate who quoted somebody in the Tea Party who said, yes, they call us extreme, but they said that about the John Birch Society, too. Okay. But I also think they arose in reaction to President Bush, and I think this is something the liberals probably don't pay enough attention to. When Bush lost, conservatives and Republicans understood that his popularity was very, very low, and they wanted to distance themselves from him, too. And they weren't about to say that the failures of the Bush administration can be traced to the fact that he was too conservative. So they traced it instead to the idea that George Bush was a big government conservative, that he spent too much. Never mind that a lot of that spending was in Iraq, and that he ran up big deficits, never mind that a lot of those came from the tax cuts passed at the beginning of the Bush years. And they also turned on compassionate conservatism as an idea. My book is actually quite sympathetic to compassionate conservatism, and we can talk about that. My objection was that Bush didn't put enough meat on the bones, enough money behind the talk, except in the case of AIDS in Africa, where I do think he was quite courageous. But they wanted to jettison that, and so it was a kind of twofer. It was Obama's election, but it was also how do you redefine yourself vis-a-vis Bush. They chose to redefine themselves to Bush's right. And so for those of us who are progressive, they are, it's an astonishing thing. We would think we would want them to move the Republican Party more to the center, but that was not their point of view on this. And I think that's where a lot of that energy came from. And then the health care bill kind of crystallized it and became, even though it was, as everybody knows, originally a Republican idea, it became a symbol of the new big government that they were revolting against.
Sure, I guess I tend to hear from liberals sort of two different views of the Tea Party, of who these people are. One, and I see both of them in this book. One is that they are basically sincere people who are extremely conservative and in a lot of ways conventional old school Republicans, but essentially sincere and motivated by adherence to an ideology. And on the other hand, that they are basically dupes, that they are being manipulated by corporate interests, that the Koch brothers and all these big money interests have basically taken people who are maybe a little bit stupid or kooky and brainwashed them. And that's really why they're doing what they're doing. Where do you fall on that?
Well, I never like to call people I disagree with stupid because I love to talk about mail that I get from my readers, and somehow people tend to write you more when they disagree than when they agree, human nature. And one of my favorite letters I can actually repeat to this very polite audience began, "Dear Mr. Dionne, are you as dumb in person?" And so whatever else you get out of this session today, you'll be able to answer that question for yourself. So I don't like to call that people I disagree with stupid. If I think someone's made an argument I consider stupid, I will say that or direct or try to refute the argument. But I do believe those two things I would phrase them a little differently. Obviously I think most people who come to the Tea Party are sincere in their beliefs, but their particular beliefs were very convenient to a certain kind of corporate right. A good example of someone who was very shrewd in jumping onto the Tea Party bandwagon was former Congressman Dick Armey, who, by the way, once wrote me a letter. He sent me his book, and it said, "Dear E.J., hope you enjoy this book. this will give you an idea of what I think and what I think of what you think. So I kind of liked that. But, you know, Army and the Koch brothers and lots of other pre-existing, well-established Republican organizations realized that these guys gave them troops that they didn't have in the 2008 election. And so they gave them a lot of funding. And that, you know, the Tea Party is like other groups on the right end of the spectrum, but they had a few extra things going for them. They had a network in Fox News. They had a troupe of talk show hosts led by Rush Limbaugh. They had a media absolutely obsessed with Sarah Palin in 2009, 2010. As you know, the secret 2-page views online were the word Sarah Palin for a long time, because both the people who hated her and who loved her loved to read these stories. And then they had all this money. So they had an influence beyond their share of the electorate. I figure the polls that I sort of trust suggest, depending on how you ask people, you're talking somewhere between 11 and 20% of the country, of registered voters or of adults, are Tea Party folks, which is a significant share of our population, but a minority share.
Sticking with the concept of internal Republican Party conflicts, I guess, where do you see, what kind of Republican do you think Mitt Romney is?
It was actually hard to know who Mitt Romney is, and that's not a partisan statement, because I think he has shaped himself to 2 different electorates in his career, and that when he was running in Massachusetts, my home state, I should note, he knew that running to the right and winning a statewide race in Massachusetts wasn't going to work for him, and so he didn't. And one of the, I think, in a way, one of the most devastating videos of Mitt Romney is his answer on abortion in a debate in Massachusetts, where he talked about how strongly pro-choice he was. And what's devastating about it is how utterly sincere and convincing he looks, declaring how pro-choice he is. I mean, he's very persuasive. I was surprised that video didn't get more use in the Republican primaries. And of course, he helped create the Massachusetts healthcare system, which, no matter how you slice it, is a model for the system President Obama created for the United States. He started moving to the right, not in this election, but before he ran for president in 2006, 2007. And right now, he seems to have adopted almost every position on the conservative and right-wing wish list. He even, in the primaries, went to the right of Rick Perry on immigration. You know, it's odd to think of Rick Perry as a liberal, but in those immigration debates, Rick Perry was a relative liberal compared to Mitt Romney and some of the other Republicans. And so the question you ask is, which is the real Mitt Romney? And I don't think we really know the answer to that question. The one thing you might be able to say is he does seem to respond to the political forces he's dealing with, and that if he were elected, it is highly likely that the Republicans will control the House, might control the Senate. And I think he will follow through on a lot of these conservative positions. There's no evidence that he's given since 2007 that he wouldn't, you know, enact the Ryan budget and do these other things. And I think the one thing that's clear he believes, and there was a wonderful piece in New York Magazine about this, is he believes in a certain kind of capitalism as defined by himself and other innovators in groups like Bain Capital. And so I actually think the debate over Bain Capital is going to be substantively significant. I mean, the Obama people are obviously going to use every outsourced job, every company that failed, just to hurt his image. But I actually think beneath that campaign is a very interesting argument over what kind of capitalism we want as Americans.
Well, you raise an interesting point with the Bain debate, because of course it's also been a debate within the Democratic Party, or of how they are messaging that point, and a lot of the so-called Acela corridor elites objecting to Obama himself and the way the Obama campaign originally were framing the Bain issue, and really being alarmed that the party risked being seen as anti-capitalist and engaging in class warfare. And that's a big part of the book too. You're arguing that the Democratic Party needs to return to a more favorable view of the original populists, and to embrace that type of class warfare more ardently, just as an economic platform. So So given all that, I guess I want to know where you come down on the Great Bain debate, although you've partially said. And then also, since I asked you what kind of Republican you think Romney is, I'd like to know what kind of Democrat you think the president is.
Thank you. I was very annoyed with the New York Times this morning, not because they wrote a bad story, but because they wrote a good story on Bain as the lead item of the paper, because I had written a couple of days ago a column to run in tomorrow's paper, basically saying the Bain debate has been settled and that the issue has clearly helped Obama. And I am very struck, for those of you who didn't look at it, it was a very interesting poll, an NBC News Wall Street Journal poll published Monday or Tuesday, where you don't usually get political science kind of experiments in the middle of a campaign, but here you could compare attitudes of Americans toward Romney's business experience in the whole country versus the swing states that have been subjected to the Bain treatment, if you will, as they would say in political science. These people have seen a lot of these ads. And if I'm remembering the numbers right, in the country as a whole, Romney's business experience makes you like him more was 23%, makes you like him less was 28%. In the swing states, it was 18% to 33 or 34%. So there's clearly something going on there. And what I argue in the column is that it's not just Bain, but that the American public is not anti-business, but they are skeptical of the idea that everything that is good for business is good for job creation or for average Americans. And I have a chapter on populism of the book that plays off the title of Tom Frank's book, What's the Matter with Populism? And I think liberals were a little misled by the history that Richard Hofstadter wrote of the populists back in the 50s. I'm a huge Hofstadter fan. I would love to write as well or have as many insights as Hofstadter had, but I have some disagreements with Hofstadter. And I think that a lot of liberals in the 50s, conditioned by the experience of the Nazis and Stalinism, were deeply skeptical of mass popular movements. And so they tended to look at those aspects of the populists that seem less rational. They looked at examples of anti-Semitism, whereas I think later historians have suggested that they were, if there was an anti-Semitic strain there were those strains in other parts of the population too, and that they were not uniquely or unusually anti-Semitic. And it was trying to present the populists as a bunch of crazy yahoos. When in fact, if you look at the American populists, they were deeply in the American tradition, deeply democratic. Many of the reforms they proposed were forward-looking. If you look at the 1892 populist platform, a lot of it came to pass finally through the New Deal. And they were also not anti-intellectual. They were known as one later scholar has said, they were known as a reading and writing party. They organized all kinds of seminars in rural America about politics. And so, the Republicans, I think, and the conservatives have been brilliant at accusing the other side of engaging in class warfare on economic issues, and then themselves engaging in relentless class warfare on social issues. That you could imagine, in fact, I think I've heard it at Aspen, conservative speakers talking about all of those rich Aspen liberals. And so they don't mind class warfare, they just don't want it to be class warfare on economic issues. And I think to have an argument over whether inequality has grown too much in the United States does not make you a class warrior, but if it does, then I see nothing wrong with being a class warrior. And I think Democrats are always sort of too quick to sort of pull back. I think the best line, I think it was Warren Buffett who said, yes, there has been a class war and my side has won.
Well, and so to go back to Obama, he has always seemed to me to be a little bit uncomfortable making this argument. And I think you said that as well. Do you think, would you have him be a stronger voice for this type of argument?
I think he's become a stronger one. I think Obama is fundamentally a moderate politician. I just had at an earlier session a friendly argument with someone where if the Democrats are such a left-wing party, why did they pass the old Republican health care plan and not single payer, or at least get a public option in? If they're such a left-wing party, why did they pass a relatively moderate, some would say watered-down version of Wall Street reform? If they're so left-wing, why was a third of the stimulus tax cuts? I mean, this is not a radical president. I joke, I know socialists, and they're insulted when President Obama is called a socialist, you know? And I think that there was a contradiction inherent in the 2008 Obama campaign, and it was a contradiction that helped him during the campaign but created problems later, because there are two core promises Obama made. One was, I'm going to make fundamental changes in the country to make it work better, and the other is, I'm going to make us all get along and get rid of all this red-blue stuff and all this deep division. Well, given the array of forces in American politics, and given where the Republican Party has moved over a period of time, you couldn't do A and B at the same time. And you saw that on the health care bill, where whatever the problems with the health care bill, this was a huge step for the country. And it was really fulfilling that promise he made, I'm going to do big things. Well, guess what? That ran into a partisan buzzsaw. And he couldn't even get Olympia Snowe, who cast one vote for it in committee, to vote for it on final passage. And so I think it was that contradiction. I also think Obama is someone who has always believed he could persuade or at least calm down conservatives, because I think one of the most interesting biographical facts is he was elected president of the Harvard Law Review by the conservatives. That is to say, if they were a conservative minority who provided the swing vote, because they saw Obama as a reasonable guy who listened to them, who paid attention to them, who liked intellectual exchange. It's one of the attractive things about him, in fact. But I think it led him to believe that he could persuade the conservatives on the Harvard Law Review, and so he could do the same with Eric Cantor. Well, that's a different kettle of fish, or Mitch McConnell. And, and so I think he wasted too much time trying to keep the first half of that promise long after it was, should have been clear that it wasn't going to work. I think since the debt ceiling fight, he has moved to make some really, I think, some substantive arguments. And if I can just close on this, some of you may remember that he went to Osawatomie, Kansas in December of last year. Osawatomie was where Theodore Roosevelt gave his great new nationalism speech in 1910, and Teddy Roosevelt's a hero in my book. And I was so excited when I heard this. I think the only person who was happier that he went to Osawatomie was the president of was the president of the Osawatomie Chamber of Commerce. And I think he was signaling that he's ready to make a bigger argument and accepting the fact that we're in the middle of this big argument about our future, and we can't move forward until we settle it.
I wonder, though, do you fault his leadership skills at all for that inability to make deals and persuade? Because one criticism that I hear from Democrats as well as Republicans is that because he has this sort of intellectual temperament and because he has this desire to hear all sides and to maybe equivocate, that he is not a deal maker.
Well, there is a column I wrote in that earlier period that I know the administration didn't like very much, where I said, concessions we can believe in was not Obama's slogan in 2008. And so I do think that, first of all, let me back up, that I have a lot of respect for Obama. I met him when he was a young state senator, have always liked him and think he is a really thoughtful person. And I agree with him, especially where I was in a minority in Washington, I think, in fighting the health care bill to the end. And I continue to believe, and I think it's an easier position to defend this week than it was last week, that this will give him a significant place in history because he took a really big step toward universal coverage. So my criticisms of Obama should be seen as within a context of a basic respect for a guy who inherited a heck of a lot of problems and was dealt a very difficult hand. But I do think that in that period, there was a feeling, for example, on the health care bill, I think it should have been obvious much earlier that there was not going to be a bipartisanship in the Senate. And I think that I wish Senator Baucus had sort of moved off this effort to appease Senator Grassley, which was never going to happen, and that they had written a bill much earlier. And I still believe that if they could have had some health care bills on the floor by the summer and get this debate out of the way in October, Scott Brown might not be a senator today, and the health bill would look different because it was that long process that really made the health care bill looked terrible to people. It was like if you leave a bottle of milk outside for 6 months, you know what that bottle of milk is like. And I think that was what the healthcare bill was like for people. And I think so that I think there was a sort of too much hope that a certain negotiating style would work. So I think, I write in the book that I think in that period, I think that was mistaken. I understand where it came from. I don't think it was badly motivated. I just think it was a terrible mistake. And I think it particularly hurt the image of the healthcare bill.
Is that perhaps also an argument that Obama was too inexperienced when he took office?
I don't know. I suppose I've heard people say that. I mean, it's a plausible argument in the sense that he had not been around the national scene that long. On the other hand, I don't think that's it. I think that he is someone who really does not like conflict. In other words, I think there's an interesting two sides to Obama. On the one hand, I think on the whole, he doesn't like conflict. He is a conciliator by nature, but he is also extremely competitive. And I think the sports side of Obama is very important, so that when he's in the middle of a campaign, he can get very tough. And he was very tough on John McCain and on Hillary Clinton. And so in those contexts, he doesn't have that problem. But in the governing mode, there was not a link between that Obama and the governing Obama. And so I think it's, he's got an interesting and complicated temperament, in that there's certain aspects of that temperament that are actually more attractive in some ways than someone who might have been more pugilistic. And yet I think the times call for him to temper his temperance with a little more pugilism.
Well, since you brought up healthcare, I'd love to hear what you think of the Supreme Court decision, especially in light of how critical you have been of the Roberts Court, in particular the Citizens United decision, but also your comments about Scalia came in light of the court's decision on the Arizona immigration bill. So, and we're hearing this morning, it was just reported, I believe by CBS, that Roberts actually did change his vote, that he was originally the majority, would have been in a majority to overturn the entire law, and then ostensibly or reportedly for political reasons, changed to the sort of more complicated and more muddled verdict that we ended up getting.
That's really interesting, because there was Garrett Epps, I quoted earlier, had an interesting blog on this, where if you actually read the decisions, they refer at one point, one of the conservative dissenters refers to the Ginsburg dissent, which wasn't a dissent. So it looked like there were some things that went on pretty quickly there. For those of you who haven't read it, she is here at Aspen, Professor Pam Carlin of Stanford, whom I should say was my wife's favorite professor in law school and also one of my favorite people, has an excellent piece on the front of the New York Times Week in Review section today, where I think Roberts is a very shrewd man. And I think that, on the one hand, I just have to say I am glad he did what he did. I think it would have been bad for the court, and I personally think bad for the country, to throw out the healthcare law. So what I'm saying now is not grudging, but an attempt to understand why did Roberts do what he did. And I think that Roberts does have a broad conservative agenda for the court over the long run. There will be other decisions in the future that are going to go on the conservative side on 5-4 votes. This was the first time Justice Roberts had been on the liberal side of a 5-4 vote in his entire time on the Supreme Court. I think he understood that the court was under a lot of attack. I think he understood that its legitimacy was in question. And so what he did is he, as Pam Carlin says, he stored up some weapons for conservatives to use later in this decision, notably by trying to narrow the use of the Commerce Clause for progressive legislation. I was very disappointed by the way they weakened the Medicaid provision, which I think really is a severe limitation on Congress's ability to legislate. As someone told me recently, it's odd that Congress can tell universities they'll lose all their federal aid if they don't have ROTC on campus, but states can't lose their federal aid if they don't want to extend health coverage. I mean, there's an odd view of what power Congress does or does not have there. And so I think he did not want to have the battle over the legitimacy of the court right now, but he is also preparing the way for further conservative moves by the court. So I think it was you know, I think on the whole it was a shrewd move, even though a lot of conservatives are disappointed. I think you saw a real split, by the way, in conservative opinion. You saw sort of commentary and sort of intellectual conservatives, Charles Krauthammer and George Will, saying, well, we won a big victory on the Commerce Clause, trying to defend him on that. And then you saw a lot of the Tea Party conservatives, and quite a few others, even and including the Wall Street Journal editorial page, basically treating him like a sellout. So it's,
Right.
but I think it was a shrewd move on his part, but it doesn't, I don't think it means that John Roberts is going to be a judicial liberal.
Well, I could ask you questions all day, but I'd like to open the floor for questions. I'm sure these people have lots of things they'd like to ask you as well. We can get a microphone back
So,
there.
gentlemen, I always welcome dissenting questions, by the way. I always like to tell the story. I had a very dear Republican uncle I spent 35 years arguing politics with. And when he died, his kids, my cousins, I was very grateful to them because they let me do the eulogy for my Uncle Ray. And in my eulogy, I couldn't resist quoting Richard Nixon. And it was a Nixon quote I liked about the man in the arena that he got from Teddy Roosevelt. But I also said that I also did it because I was hoping that if I quoted Nixon, my dear Uncle Ray would rise up out of the casket and come back to life just to tell me I knew you'd be quoting Nixon someday. And so I want to say, please, impolite questions are not impolite. Go ahead.
Well, this might be too polite. I am Nancy Zirkin, and I'm from Washington, D.C. Hi, EJ.
How are you?
Fine. Question and a comment. It was a big week in terms of Supreme Court decisions. You have mentioned ACA, the American Care Act, but there was also the Arizona immigration decision. Your column this week was very interesting, probably one of the most interesting I've seen, because what we saw in the Arizona case was Anton Scalia clearly legislating from the bench and playing politics. If you could comment on that, because I don't think everybody in this room saw that op-ed. Thank you.
If I can start off, I just want to say, I ran into EJ earlier, and we were talking about this column, and he said, well, I could have just said, oh, Scalia, isn't he terrible? But then I'd just be another liberal, you know, complaining about Scalia. So I decided to stir the pot a little and call on him to resign.
Right. I thought that it was enough for liberals to wring their hands because I thought he crossed a very important line here, that he had been pushing the line for a long time. I mean, there's a famous case of Dick Cheney having a case coming up to the court, and then he went duck hunting with Dick Cheney, and he said this, he put out a 22-page statement saying he doesn't have to recuse himself, and noted that he had not, hunted in the same blind as Vice President Cheney or really discussed the case with him, so no one had any reason to worry about whether he'd rule fairly. And there were other cases where, but here I thought the reason I went to saying he should resign is because he crossed a line into politics in a way that I don't think justices should cross or typically do cross. Because he did two things in that bench statement. One is he attacked implicitly, but fairly explicitly criticized President Obama's decision on the DREAM, to do a version of the DREAM Act through executive order. The DREAM Act had nothing to do with the Arizona case. In other words, if you wanted to criticize President Obama on something connected with the case, well, okay. But this was just an intervention in a live political issue that seemed totally out of line with the conventions that judges live by, because they've got a lot of unaccountable power. And we count on them to, live by certain rules. Then there was another paragraph where it sounded like a speech at a Tea Party rally about Arizona suffering under illegal immigration and on people's front lawns and all this. I mean, it really was a straight Tea Party rally speech. And so I crossed the line from just hand-wringing liberal criticism of Scalia to saying this is beyond the pale. And so that's why I wrote that column. And obviously it's part of a larger critique of what I see as a conservative willingness to use the courts in a way to assert conservative power that I think goes beyond anything that passes for restraint. Begins with Bush v. Gore, it goes to Citizens United, The other decision this week that didn't get that much attention was involving the Service Employees Union, where on the one hand, at least a couple of the liberals agreed that there needed to be some check on that, but then there was an additional 5-judge majority that violated, it looked like it violated a rule of the court where they stepped out and decided an issue that wasn't even in the case that came very close to enacting a national right to work law. And this is just an abuse of judicial power, I believe, but I think Justice Scalia in this case, maybe we can argue about what decisions they make, but this just stepped way beyond that. So that's why I went there.
If I can play devil's advocate a little bit, though, there was a moment in the healthcare decision that conservatives saw as equally political in Justice Ginsburg's writing, where she referred to the Massachusetts healthcare law in a way that some Republicans saw as gratuitous and as a swipe at Mitt Romney. And is this just a case of it's judicial activism when they rule against your side and it's not when they don't?
Well, no. First of all, in the case, sure, that sort of thing does happen. There's no question about it, but I don't, my theory of jurisprudence is, I'm not a lawyer, so it's pretty pretentious to have a theory of jurisprudence, but I have always broadly agreed with what became known as the New Deal consensus, or the New Deal settlement, where the courts leave Congress very broad room to legislate on social matters and intervene mainly to protect the rights of minorities who cannot always count on a democratic system to protect their rights because they are minorities. And it's the nature of one person, one vote, or majority rule that minorities sometimes are under threat. I think that is an approach to jurisprudence that in broad terms I agree with. There's another approach to jurisprudence that goes back to the Gilded Age, which really uses such an expansive view of property rights, turns the 14th Amendment's guarantees that were designed to protect the rights of African Americans and turns them into a way of protecting the rights of corporations. And I think the conservatives are very explicit. They call it the Constitution in exile. They want to go back to the interpretation that the courts were giving in that Gilded Age all the way through the early New Deal. These are the two big choices on the table. I think in broad terms, the New Deal settlement was the proper way to go, and that the conservatives want to push us back in that direction. And that's what the argument's about. I would want to look back on the Ginsburg, what she said about the Massachusetts healthcare law. The one thing I would say that distinguishes that from what Scalia did is that I do think the Massachusetts healthcare law has a completely intimate relationship with the Obama healthcare law, whereas this kind of, and also she wrote it in a decision, this was an explosion from the bench about a very recent policy decision by someone who is the sitting president of the United States by a justice of the Supreme Court. So I don't see those two as opposites. I will concede up front, I agree more with Justice Ginsburg than Justice Scalia, but I don't think that's the only difference in these two statements.
All right, let's go to the front here.
One of the most interesting and distinguished law professors in the United States. Now you can introduce yourself.
Sandy Levinson. There's a way of reading the Scalia decision that says we're trying to protect a vulnerable minority called youngsters, because what's really behind the mandate, which I fully support, is to force people who believe that they are either immortal or they're certainly not going to get sick for quite a while to buy medical insurance. And this is redistribution. And so Scalia wants to read the Constitution to give youngsters a libertarian right to opt out. Now, in an earlier discussion, you said you've been heartened by students who taught.
Wait, can you pull the mic closer? It's just...
Okay, is this better?
Yeah, there you go.
You've spoken elsewhere of your experience teaching students at Georgetown and speaking to students. Do you find among our students a willingness to say, yeah, we really are in a community, and it is people my age who are much, much more likely to need medical care than they are, but we're all in this together? Or do you think they share the Scalian view that why should we pay for medical care of people who are 20 years older than we are?
You know, there's a funny story about this, that this was years ago, that the Democratic National Committee was sending out a mailing, and it was supposed to go to senior citizens, and it was about Medicare and Medicaid, and instead it was about protecting older Americans, and instead it went to a youth list. And the mail actually did better with the youth list than it did with the older people. So kids, it turns out, care about their parents and grandparents to a surprising degree, which as I get older, I'm very grateful for. But no, I mean, my sense, and this is what Sandy and I were talking about earlier after another panel, in my book, the millennial generation, sort of 35 and under, are really the deus ex machina of my argument, because I believe devoutly that this new generation coming up has all the makings of being something like the next greatest generation. They are much more community-minded. They actually believe, they are skeptical of certain aspects of government, but they believe that government can make a positive contribution. They have performed all kinds of service, including, it should be noted, 2 million of men and women in the armed forces over this decade of war. And so I think their instincts they are at one and the same time, and that's why they fit into my, or at least I believe and argue from data, and not just my own sentiment about them because I teach them, that they are both more individualistic and more communitarian. They're more us than the rest of us. You know, they're more tolerant, they're more open to others, they are a more diverse generation, they're a more racially and ethnically diverse generation. And yet, you know, they're better at new technology. They didn't just start tweeting about a month ago as I did. But they quickly, you know, I think it's significant that they sort of use the new kind of individualizing technologies and quickly form social networks, because on the other side, they have more communitarian values. So that I'm sure there are some of the Ron Paul supporting young, and Ron Paul did much better among young Republicans. You know, he was the only reason young voters were voting in the Republican primary. So there is certainly a young, straight-out libertarian wing of the millennial generation. But my reading of all the surveys suggests they are much more communitarian than Scalia thought they were. So yes, he was speaking for that, Ron Paul group, but I think they are a minority of that larger generation.
We are just about out of time. I'd really like to get in one last question if somebody still has one. Maybe we've answered all of your questions. There's nothing else you need to know about American politics. But,
is this working? Follow on to the leadership question on President Obama as a leader. I'd like your views on how he's handling the looming sequestration, because it seems to me that this is a great opportunity to reach out to the American people to let them know what's coming, and it seems like our congressional leaders are happy just to argue about it and possibly not get to a solution.
Yeah, there's a lot of me that wishes that both Romney and Obama would say flatly and in some detail what should happen after November. Most of you follow all this stuff. $7 trillion are on the table over the next decade. If Congress doesn't do anything by January 1st, all the Clinton tax rates come back, which is something like $3.5 trillion over a decade. The cuts from that are supposed to go into effect automatically, $1.2 trillion. There are some fixes, doc fixes in Medicare and various other things. It all totals up to about $7 trillion. Now, a lot of people actually are scared of this. It's being called tax-ageddon. I am actually looking forward to this, and not simply because I write a newspaper column, and it'll be great for those of us who are journalists. I think it's really forced the issue in a way it has to be forced, that it make it very hard to just walk away from this. And I think for those of us who think you do have to raise taxes in order to balance the budget, we can argue about how much and what the mix is, but to me, there is absolutely no question that we will never balance our budget on the basis of the revenue we have now. And unless you want to repeal the aging of the baby boom, which as a baby boomer, I really wish we could, but we can't. We're going to have a lot of costs coming online, even if we reform Medicare and Social Security, because there are a whole lot of us who are going to retire. And so we're going to need more revenue. And I think this creates pressure to come to a deal that will include tax increases. Yes, I would love Obama to engage in this, but I have learned long ago that there is one rule in politics, which is almost never do politicians engage in behavior, however public-spirited it may seem, that they decide is not in their political interest. And I think both Obama and Romney figure that going into any more detail than they already have. I mean, Obama's given a general sense of where he wants to go. He wants the Clinton tax cuts for the well-to-do to expire. He wants the rest to go through. He'd like to do tax reform. He would accept some cuts in the entitlements, but not, he hasn't specified. There were some in the Boehner deal, but they backed away from some of those. So he's put out a fair amount, but I don't think we're going to get more detail, even though I think it would be very useful for the country if we did. But there's a lot of detail I'd like from politicians that they don't give us, and I don't particularly blame them for it because they want to win an election.
All right, I'd like to close by just asking you to talk about the future and how hopeful you are, if at all, that these tensions and the gridlock and the broken system you described can actually be resolved and get better.
Thank you, because I'm really grateful for that question, because the book begins by talking about American decline, and I note that we argue about American decline a lot, which actually is a sign, over different periods. You remember the period when we were declining relative to the Japanese. And I note that the fact that we talk about decline so much actually shows what a high opinion we have of ourselves, because we always think we are in a place from which we can decline. But the book is very much not a declinist book. I'm a kind of anti-declinist. I don't believe that just because other powers are rising in the world, not only China, which is going to face some real problems in the long run, but also India, Brazil. There are going to be other important powers. I don't think the rise of those powers means that the United States will somehow shrink back into an unimportant power in the world. I think that if we can show that we can govern ourselves with any kind of good sense, we will remain a very, very important nation for a long time. I was at a dinner party in Washington where the foreign minister of a friendly country came, and he said, I've been telling everybody here that the whole world would say American decline is over. They'd stop talking about it. If you just settled your deficit thing, if you got a long-term deficit solution, all this talk around the world would stop. And then the Americans at the table quickly got into an argument, split along partisan lines about why this was so difficult. And my friend from abroad said, all right, I tried to keep you from decline. If you don't want to do it yourselves, that's up to you. So I think we can easily get there. But would you mind if I do one, I want to do one close on sort of the other reason I wrote this book. I want to close just by linking up. I always like to do this. John Winthrop and Bruce Springsteen. Now, you may ask, what in the world do these two have to do with each other? One of the things I came to really like in the course of writing this book was the John Winthrop speech that Ronald Reagan actually used to draw from when he talked about us as a shining city on a hill. And it was a 1630 speech sermon, really, by John Winthrop of Massachusetts, entitled A Model of Christian Charity. And just this one sentence I really like. It's, we must delight in each other, make others' conditions our own, rejoice together, mourn together, labor and suffer together, always having before our eyes our community as members of the same body. Rush Limbaugh would probably call this Puritan a socialist. Now, think about those words. And then think about, how many of you have heard Bruce Springsteen's new album? Any Springsteen fans here? Excellent. A couple more. The first song on that album, the refrain is, wherever this flag is flown, we take care of our own. Now, in a very, very compact way, Bruce Springsteen is saying exactly what John Winthrop said. So from 1630 to 1912, I think there is a continuum about a core American value of being concerned about community and the common good. I think this is one of the greatest things about us as Americans. I wrote this book to lift it up, and whether you read the book or not, I hope you all will lift that up as an American value too. Thank you all very, very much.
Thank you, everybody.